welcome to everybody. My name is Hilary Inwood and I'm lead of Environmental and Sustainability Education at OISE. Very happy to welcome you here today to join in this webinar. We have a couple members of the EcoSchools team from the TDSB. I'm very happy to welcome Penn Miller into this space today with us. Very happy to welcome Elise Kennedy, who's part of that team as well. And of course, our instructor, Susan Elliott, who is leading our additional qualification course, part 3 for the environmental ed specialists. So happy to welcome so many of you into this space today. We are very happy to be offering a session on leadership in environmental and sustainability education. This absolutely relates to the topic of the additional qualification course for our specialist teachers. But I think it relates to all of you because I know that many of you do take leadership in different ways. I do want to remind you that these talks are sponsored by OISE, but more importantly by the TDSB's EcoSchools program, which has done phenomenal leadership, might I add, in terms of environmental and sustainability ed over the years and continues to do so. So we are very happy to be working in partnership with them at OISE. And I'm hoping, I know many of you are teachers in their programs, and you know the kind of leadership they offer, which is really exciting. I am going to begin with land acknowledgement. As part of these land acknowledgements this spring with our webinars, we have been introducing the work of Indigenous artists from across Canada. So I'll begin with the land acknowledgement, and then I'm going to just tell you a little bit about Gerald's work. We acknowledge that we are hosted on the lands of the Mississaugas of the First Credit, of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Wendat. We also recognize the enduring presence of all First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples on this land. And certainly, we want you, as part of these land acknowledgements, to think about your relationship to the land. We are all treaty people, so we want you to think about a little bit about that, and we certainly want you to think about how you build relationship with and care for the land as part of a land acknowledgement. So Gerald Mcmaster is from the Red Pheasant First Nation. I chose him specifically because he is originally from Saskatchewan, which is where our keynote speaker is from today. Gerald's worked in a variety of media to comment on issues of colonialism in his work, and he's done this for a very long time. He's been a practicing artist since the 80s. This is actually one of his earlier pieces from '93. He has been focused more recently on curatorial work and has been really held a number of very prestigious cultural postings over his career, including the curator of contemporary, at that point it was called Contemporary Indian Art, which tells you how far that goes back, in what is now known as the Museum of History in Gatineau, Quebec. But he's also been one of the lead curators at the Art Gallery of Ontario too. So he's curated a number of very significant exhibitions on contemporary Indigenous art in Canada and has shown his own work, which is both 2- and 3-dimensional, both nationally and internationally. So I'm happy to be able to share that work today. So at this point, I am very happy to introduce our keynote speaker for this morning, and that's Dr. Marcia McKenzie. She's a professor in the Department of Educational Foundations and director of the Sustainability Education Research Institute at the University of Saskatchewan, and of course that's here in Canada. She is a principal investigator of the Sustainability and Education Policy Network. I do encourage you to visit their website, which is www.sepn.ca, and is leading a brand new major SSHRC, which is the Social Sciences Humanities Research Council funded project called Monitoring and Evaluation of Climate Change Education research project, and she'll be talking to you a little bit about that today. She recently led and co-led work on 2 UNESCO studies, one that focuses on countries' progress on climate change education, and a second one that focused on cognitive, social, and emotional and behavioral learning in regards to education for sustainable development and global citizenship education, focusing on everything from pre-primary to the secondary level. She is an editor and an author of 4 books and countless articles. She's a wonderful author. I can highly recommend reading anything that she's written. And she's co-editor of the Palgrave Studies in Education and the Environment book series. So we are very pleased to welcome this morning Marcia McKenzie. Thanks for joining us, Marcia. Just before we get underway, I should tell you that of the people who have joined us so far in the room, we've about 60% of those are elementary teachers. Another 15% roughly are secondary teachers. We've got about 15% who are OISE students, and another 10% or so roughly who are OISE faculty or staff members. So we're very happy to have them here. And in terms of the question that we asked around environmental leadership, Over 50% said that they were active environmental leaders. Another 35% who said that they were environmental leaders in small ways, and another 13% who said that they aspired to leadership. They're not there yet, but they're going to get there soon. So that's who's in the room with you this morning.
Great. Thanks, Hillary. Well, hello, everyone. Good morning. I'm very pleased to be joining you from Treaty 6 territory and homeland of the Métis today to talk about this topic. I was asked to speak to a few different aspects, which is to talk a little bit about how I got to, what I'm up to these days and my journey over the last few decades, and then also to introduce you to the work that we've been doing through SEPN, which has been in Canada as well as more recently globally. And we've just finished up the big Canadian study that we worked on for 8 years. So I'm going to focus most of the presentation and sharing some of those results, which are just, I was saying to Hillary, this is the first time I'll be presenting the overview from our final report, which hasn't come out yet. So you can be a test audience and give me some input, and look forward to your thoughts there. And then just to wrap up with some thoughts about the environmental and sustainability education, or ESE, field more broadly, and how we can further develop leadership and some venues for that, kind of both nationally and globally. Moving into a little bit about how I got here, I was thinking, I don't actually think of it that often, but talking to a bunch of Toronto-based teachers and educators that I actually grew up in Toronto and went through the school system there until I moved away to go to university. So I had my beginnings in that area and on Canadian Shield land there. And the picture on the top left is me as when I was 17, when I went on my first big canoe trip, which I always, had I was away for the whole summer, and it had such a powerful experience on me that even though it seems corny, it was sort of a real pivotal moment that sort of set me on my trajectory of, through my university degrees, trying to figure out, how do I, learn how to provide the, type of experience that had such an impact on me and other youth at that time. So that led me through some of the degrees that you can see on the one side there. And I won't, go into a lot of detail, but it basically, so I started out guiding canoe trips and did a diploma in outdoor leadership to do that, and then realized, no, this is taking middle-class people on vacation. This isn't quite right. And finally found, you can do education on this, and did my master's at Brock University on Outward Bound. And so very much came in through the outdoor ed angle rather than the formal K-12 angle. And it wasn't until my PhD that I focused more on that, realizing that, I wanted to work in contexts where all, communities, had access to the types of experiences versus those that had the time or the resources to go on specific programs. So I did my doctoral work looking at 3 different secondary school programs on global and environmental education, and including a World College on the West Coast, as well as a grade 12 global studies class and a public Montessori program. And so looking at different aspects of those and how students learn to have agency on issues in various ways through those different types of programs. And then I moved into a postdoc, and which focused specifically on teacher education, and then moved into the position that I have here at the University of Saskatchewan, and have developed different projects and work through my time here. On the right, or my right, I think it's your right too, yes, is my daughter Helena a few years ago. And I put that up because just above it is Saskatoon, where I now live. And a few years ago, we had really bad forest. Well, we've had lots of forest fires in the last while, as I know, other parts of the country have as well. And that was that summer. And, it's just, that's when I really started to focus on climate change education specifically, just kind of the visceral power of the smoke and, having a young daughter and all of that. So that's why I kind of put that piece in my personal journey as well. So I'm going to switch to the next slide, which talks a little bit about what I've been doing, I guess, since I came to the U of S. We did found a center, which you can see a picture in the top left there of some grad students and staff working in the center that we have at the university and SERI. And through that center, we've done various activities with different partners, including we've been hosting biannual conferences. I think the last time I saw Hillary in person was at a conference we had here, as well as a policy forum of Canadian policymakers in K-12 and higher ed working on sustainability in education. We partner with our local provincial specialist association, Sask Outdoors. I think in Ontario, you have one as well. I'm forgetting CO or something like that. I forget the acronym, but they're a fantastic group here, really active, and we've collaborated with them on an amazing journal that I want to highlight. They take the lead on it, and it's a great venue for papers, small pieces about programs or that you may be working in. Have your students write things for that. So that's Of Land and Living Skies, something to check out. Beautiful layout done by Karen McIver, and it's available online as well as print form. We've run a master's here in critical environmental ed, as well as we have a regular master's program in social and ecological justice, and various publications in this area as well. And actually, Hillary mentioned before we started that someone had messaged her about an MOU, seeing something about an MOU we just signed, and so I can mention that as well. Partnership with the local school division here. And I can tell that story a little bit more. It's kind of interesting because it came about through my daughter, not through my professional work, initially. But that's exciting, and it's specifically on climate change education. So yeah, I can get into more of those things as we go if people are interested. But I wanted to focus some of my time to talk about the work that we've done with one of the research projects that I've been involved with since getting here, and that is we were funded by SSHRC as well on this to create the Sustainability and Education Policy Network, which initially started out as a national network across Canada to do Canadian research, and we've kind of maintained SEPN as an entity and now is hosting some of our newer work, which is more global and focused on climate change education. But I'm going to focus with some of the results from our Canadian study, given the context here, and that might be most applicable to some of the work that you're doing. We've got a range of different partners in the network, and more. Our new project has 80 different partners and team members, so lots of collaboration and trying to converge, work together. SEPN's vision is to do research that really is able to inform and work together with policymakers and practitioners to make a difference in advancing climate and sustainability in formal education as well as more broadly. We've been doing, focusing on comparative research in particular, so the power of looking across sites and being able to say, well, what's happening in this school board or this one, and how by sharing that information and that, enabling entities to compare, how does that help them look at what might be possible, where they're leading things, where they could be informed by the work of other sites to move forward their work. So using that comparative research to inform and leverage change in policy in particular, but obviously also practice. And so part of doing that is working with policymakers and practitioners and organizations when we do our research, so that we're not off as researchers on our own, and then bringing the research to organizations and practice, but instead trying to work together to figure out what makes sense, what's needed, how do we do it, and then having knowledge mobilization or ways of sharing and mobilizing that work that makes sense. So things like hosting policy forums that bring together people to meet face-to-face and talk and advance their work, or developing for each academic article we've done a policy brief, so a short form with infographics that helps get across some of the key ideas in shorter forms and so on. That's a bit about what we've tried to do across our different projects. This is just, if you go to our website and you look on our resources section, you'll see different papers, and like I said, for each one there's a research brief and or infographic overview of some of the results. And then we've also done a number of studies for UNESCO and the Canadian Commission for UNESCO over the last several years. So the top right ones there are as a report we did for the Canadian Commission for UNESCO, and on climate action, schools that are involved in a pilot on climate action. And then we've also done a couple of global studies for UNESCO as well on climate change education specifically, as well as ESD more broadly, looking at comparing across different countries around the world. I wanted to highlight a few aspects that carry through kind of SEPN's work and my work before getting into the details of the Canadian study results. So that is one important aspect, is to be working with mainly, here First Nations and Métis, but Indigenous partners and researchers and organizations to recognize the important role that they play in advancing this work, and ensure, trying to ensure that we're working together as well, for myself as a non-Indigenous researcher, with Indigenous colleagues and organizations to advance shared aims. So I think Eve Tuck is a colleague there at OISE. For example, we did a bunch of work together several years ago now to try and bring together her expertise and experience as an Indigenous scholar, and my focus on environmental work to move forward considerations of place and land in both social science research as well as education. And I also lucky enough to work with my colleague Alex Wilson at the University of Saskatchewan from Opaskwayak Cree Nation, and I've had the chance to teach in our Indigenous land-based master's program that she leads. That's a photo from that last summer up in the Northwest Territories. So lots of learning, and Alex plays a central role in SEPN, and so we're able to try and collaborate on various endeavors. Also, Hillary mentioned this new project that we just had funded with $2.5 million from the federal government. It's very exciting. Just founded in June, and so we'll be moving this forward over the next 6 years. And it's a large global team with advisory committee that includes UNESCO and the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the IPCC, and the UNESCO Global Education Monitoring Report. And then it has different axes of activities, including case studies, and we'll be undertaking 30 case studies and doing calls for funding for those. So that's something to keep in mind for people that are interested in being involved in research projects in the area of climate change education. And then also we're trying to build global databases, because right now there isn't a sense of what's happening around the world. We don't really have that knowledge. And then, like I was saying, we can't use it to say benchmark or targets set as part of intergovernmental processes. So for example, under the original Climate Change Convention, where we have the COP meetings every year, as well as now with the Paris Agreement that was signed in 2015. Education is a commitment that member parties like Canada have made under those agreements, but right now, the reporting that gets done, there's a whole chapter in the reporting, say, Canada does every 4 years to the UN on their actions on climate change, the whole chapter on education, but it's all anecdotal. And, it just talks about this program there and, this other thing here. And there's nothing that we can pull together across those to say, okay, how are countries doing, so that maybe education can actually be part of the negotiation processes, because we know we have the technological and scientific know-how to address climate, but what we're missing is the social and political will, and education plays such an important part in that, and getting past the kind of denial and lack of action that we've been seeing globally. So that's a little bit about that project. And we also have regional hubs, if you look at the bottom of the figure there, which are open for anyone to participate in. So would welcome participation in the Canadian hub, which is, we've got Environment Climate Change Canada is one of the partners as well. And so we'll look for those starting up in the fall. And, okay, so I think that takes us to the SEPN Canada study, and just talk a little bit about this. And as I said, we've presented different aspects of this research, but we've pulled it together across the data sources in our draft final report. So I hope I might have too many slides, so we'll see how it goes. But just jump in with any clarifying questions. I'll be staying pretty high level to give you a sense of the work, but obviously, there's lots of information on the website, and I'm happy to follow up later as well. So we did collect various types of data for what ended up being an 8-year study. So the first component that we worked on was the document analysis, where we looked at, and I should say this project was focused on formal education. It was focused on sustainability, which we defined as needing to include at least in part, had to have a component of environmental consideration. So it wasn't financial sustainability or just social sustainability. It had to have an environmental component to how and they didn't have to be using the word sustainability. So we saw in Nunavut, for example, there were, Indigenous policies that focused on land that were definitely applicable to our analysis. Other places like Ontario tended to use, certainly at the K-12 level, tended to use the language of environment in education versus sustainability. So that all fit within the context of the study. So we looked both at higher education as well as K-12, and I'll focus today on the K-12 results. And at that level, we looked at all 13 ministries of education at the provincial and territorial level, as well as all the school divisions in the country as well. We did an analysis of the types of policies and initiatives that they are involved in, as well as we did a national survey across the country. And then we did more in-depth site analyses as well, where we went to, we picked 6 provinces and territories to go to have regional representation and along other considerations. And then for each of those, we tried to identify 2 school divisions, one more rural, one urban, and then within those school divisions, we picked 2 schools, one elementary, one secondary. And again, looking at varying levels of, on paper, did they look like they were high adopters of sustainability versus those that weren't. And we wanted to look at both and looked at other, variations to have a range of sites. So in total, we went to 20 schools across the country. So we didn't have 2 in every province or territory in the end. And then our different knowledge mobilizations that we've been up to as well. So I've organized this by some key findings from our report that kind of try and summarize across some of the different data sources. So we did find that close to half of the ministries of education and school divisions had a sustainability policy. We also, that the graphic there looks at different things. So did they have a policy that this is school division data? Did they, was the school division engaged in an eco certification like the Eco Schools program that's already mentioned? Did they have dedicated staff in the division for sustainability? And then we gave a point to each division if they had, based on publicly available information, whether they had those factors to then, score a province as a whole for, how engaged their school divisions were on those three kind of policy initiatives. So you can see Ontario comes out um, quite, it comes out the strongest across the country in that respect at the school division level, which is great. At the ministry level, a lot of provinces and territories included sustainability in cross-curricular frameworks rather than having a specific targeted policy. And only about half, including Ontario, had a specific policy. So room for growth there across the country. In terms of climate change, education, specifically, definitely lots of growth there, and I know Manitoba, for example, has developed new resources on this as a province since the data were collected for this a few years ago, and perhaps the same is true in Ontario. Hopefully, we've seen more progress since then. This climate change at the time of analysis was not a substantial aspect of ministry policy, and we did look at the education policy as well as we looked at climate policy in the different provinces and territories to see the extent to which education was mentioned there. Now, one of the things that has been shown to be really effective in engagement with environmental and sustainability in education is a whole school approach or whole institution approach. So that's including not just, and you can see the difference and see the legend for these different domains that I'm going to be talking about now. So it's not just, is it in the curriculum, but also is it in the overarching governance framework? So is it in the strategic plan of the ministry? Is it in, or the school division? Is it in the mandate of a school or the vision of a school? So those overarching priorities, which means that it, then infuses through all the decision making on other aspects and isn't just, hived off into the curriculum or, operations, which is where we see at the school division level, that a lot of the activity is in the operations domain. So that's the actual footprint of schools and school divisions. So that's another one of the domains. And then another one is community outreach. So engagement with, say, Indigenous partners and elders, or working with the municipality on action projects or different things like that would be considered. And that could be in relation to curriculum or in relation to operations, that you're engaging with those types of community partners. And then research as well as another domain. We see less at the K-12 level and more so, say, at the higher ed level. So in all our analysis, we use those domains to look at, okay, within a school division, within a ministry, where are they really working hard, and is there room for them to engage further?
Just before you go on, we have had questions in the chat room, and I had the same question about the difference between curriculum and curriculum framework.
Right. Well, when I'm using curriculum, I'm including curriculum framework in there. So yeah, in our analysis, some of our analysis, for example, at the ministry level, to see whether provinces were engaging in this, we didn't look at every grade level, every subject. We looked at the overarching kind of curricular frameworks to see if it was included there.
Right. No, I'm curious because we don't, we're always looking for our little gold star. We don't have a gold star on this map for Ontario, and we do have a pretty robust curriculum framework, but it's not.
Oh, sorry. Oh, yeah, you're right.
Not a separate document.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, so there is a curricular framework, but at the time of analysis, what this would mean is that sustainability wasn't mentioned in the curricular framework or environment.
Okay, because it has been since 2009 here. So I'm just saying, there's still a
Oh,
bit of
really?
this
Okay. Okay.
discrepancy.
Well,
That's all
that's
right.
a
We can live without the gold star. We're all right.
well, we can follow up later to yeah, look at that in more depth. But that would be what that is meant to convey. So that's interesting. So at the ministry level, curriculum was most commonly, what the whole school domain that or whole institution and domain that was engaged most. Next was governance. And then 3 ministries had policies addressing sustainability and operations, and only 1 community engagement, which I think was Manitoba. Okay, moving on to the next slide. This presents some of the same information with a bit more detail in some aspects. So you can see the ministries, the school divisions that present with a specific policy, which area tended to dominate. So for Ministry of Ed level, it was curriculum, school divisions, operations, and then just some highlights from the different locations. Ontario had the highest proportion of policies at the school division level, with 91% of 78 school divisions at the time having specific policies. That's great. And then, yeah, the colors in the table in the bar chart, or the dark color is the ministry level and light is the school division level. I mean, it makes sense that given the remits of the ministries of education, which is develop curriculum, and the remits of school divisions, which are more to provide support for schools and concerns of infrastructure, which is the area of operations, as well as there is space for obviously professional development and all of that, but it makes sense that the operations aspect is more of a focus given their responsibility for that, but also room for growth in other areas, I think. We did some work specifically with looking at some First Nations schools that were outside of the provincial system in a number of provinces. And so these are just some highlights from that specific component of the research, and looking at some aspects from those specific sites where the different domains kind of were engaged. And again, this wasn't using the language of sustainability per se, but aspects that we fit within the remit of what we were considering to be sustainability.
And Marcy, can you talk a little bit about the connections between land-based education, for example, and environmental and sustainability ed? Because I know that some of our scholars at OISE, our Indigenous scholars, have said they really don't see a connection between the two, which is an interesting take. So for the purposes of your research, you did see them as connected?
Yeah, definitely. We did, in the sense that defining sustainability broadly and imperfectly as, like, for example, SERI's mandate is, to support and advance our research concerned with land, place, environment, sustainability, right? So they're looking at the relationships between the different aspects, and a concern with the natural world and in relation to humans, I guess, and other species as well. I think they're related, but at the same time, I think it's important that they are also distinct and not. So I know that there's been concerns about land-based education being taken up as a terminology and a frame for working with non-Indigenous learners in non-Indigenous settings, which I think is not necessarily helpful. I think land-based education as a terminology that has evolved specifically over the last 10 years or so in relation to Indigenous work and questions of settler colonialism and land and land reparations and all those types of issues is very is specific, and that it's important not to take over that term or try not to sort of water down the power of the work that's being done by Indigenous educators and scholars in that area. So I think it's learning from, and there's, been some great work by Indigenous scholars, having commentaries on environmental and place-based education and what, that work can learn from Indigenous land-based work, which I think definitely we can take up, but not to take over, as a non-Indigenous educator, say not to take over the term, to do work that is, ESE, if that makes sense. So I think it's a important conversation, and but that they're not the same, but they're related, and certainly that, ESE more broadly can learn a lot from land-based and Indigenous work.
Yeah, and in fact, I got to put a plug in for my colleague Sandra Stiers, who writes
Yes.
on exactly these topics. So if anybody's
Yes.
interested, I can happy to share some articles of hers with people.
Yeah, great work on land and education. We did find that a policy presence makes it more likely that sustainability practices will exist in schools. We use this kind of cool app. This is a shot of a iPad, and where we use this heat diagram and ask students and teachers and school leadership and school division administrators and ministry administrators and other folks like eco schools staff and so on, to use this to rate their settings on sustainability engagement, both in policy. They filled it out once for policy and once for practice, and then we're able to look at the relationships between policy scores and practice scores, which was quite interesting, and more than I can go into here, but places like Manitoba, where they've got a strong ESD focus, and they had strong ministry support for that for a number of years. So they've got tons of policy at all levels, and and quite strong practice, but kind of practice is lagging behind the policy in a sense, in people's perceptions, and in what we saw as well. And then in other places where there wasn't a lot of work at the level of policy, and you saw practice kind of leading more. So, and I'll just leave you to read some of those. You probably already read some of the kind of caveats there. This is another piece we looked at in terms of the importance of policy at different levels. So it's really was interesting when we looked at different school divisions in the same province, but depending on the extent to which the school division prioritized sustainability, folks in that division and schools in that division would have different perceptions of the ministry curriculum. So because say PDs and messaging at the school division and school level, then people would know, oh yeah, this is in our curriculum and we know how to access it and mobilize it in our work, versus if there wasn't that lower level support for it, people would be, I'm not sure if it's there, or maybe it's there, but it's not, they weren't able to enact it in the same way. So that really emphasized, we looked at the relationships between these different policy levels, including the flow from global priorities, where, for example, we see ESD, Education for Sustainable Development, has been taken up, is a UN terminology and initiative that has flowed down in certain provinces like Manitoba, Quebec, not so much. I mean, in Ontario, we found that it that the decade of ESD led to certain initiatives like the Bondar report, and kind of gave new life to environmental ed in the province, but that the terminology wasn't taken on wholesale, and environmental ed was stuck with. So, and then other places like Nunavut that we looked at, where there's been very little engagement with the global mandates, but instead it's much more ground up prioritization of Indigenous law being required to be included in the curriculum, and therefore you see land being an engagement with elders and so on is a required component of education. So yeah, lots of interesting.
And I've actually got a question about that, Marcia, from Marilla.
Yeah.
Marilla says, do you have information or resources on how schools can get connected to or collaborate or build partnerships, especially with Indigenous communities? Do you have any recommendations in that regard?
Yeah, good question. I think one thing we've done as a field, we sort of say, oh, why aren't Indigenous educators showing up at our at the non-Indigenous focused conferences, like say something like ECOM, the National Environmental Ed Conference, or local conferences. But people are going to their own conferences on land-based education or Indigenous education, or so I think it's going to those sites and doing the work, say for myself as a non-Indigenous scholar, doing the work of going to those sites rather than expecting the Indigenous, partners to come to the sites where I already am working. So I don't know if that helps, but, just I guess to look around and see where you might be able to engage and meet people and develop relationships, and then find points of convergence where it's like, okay, we might be using different terminology, but we have shared aims, and how can we support, how can I support what you're doing and have it, inform our work, and so on. This obviously, you're not going to be able to read all this, but this just shows that related to the last slide, that we did find these different trajectories of, provinces, ministry, or school divisions, schools even that were using either ESD or EE or an Indigenous orientation. And what was interesting here was that the terminology seemed to correlate or relate to approaches to pedagogy and approaches to action. So it wasn't like, oh, we're all doing the same thing, we're just calling it different things. It's like, no, it actually has different qualities, which is not surprising with Indigenous work, but maybe I was a little more interested to see that, well, with EE and ESD, they actually carry different orientations to pedagogy and understandings of action. So I think that's really quite interesting and has implications.
Maria's got a question for you that I'm just going to let her share. Maria, do you mind turning on your microphone and you can just share your question directly with Marcia?
Sure, great. So I'm currently a doctoral candidate at OISE, and I'm focusing on exploring or identifying which pedagogies best support youth well-being and mental health as we teach about the very real and challenging realities of climate change and the inequitable impacts of climate change. And I'm just wondering if you found approaches that are particularly useful or supportive in this regard, that are centering youth well-being and mental health. We are seeing a rise in anxiety in young people as they face a lot of the systems that are unraveling at this time. And I've been trying to develop some core principles, but I've noted myself that most climate change education has been housed in science and is focused on causes and is not necessarily focused on this dimension. So I'm just curious if you've encountered some approaches.
Sure. Yeah, we have a climate change education primer that I'd be happy to share. We actually developed it for the school division here initially when we met with them, and what led to the development of a memorandum of understanding. But it's a short kind of synthesis of what sounds similar to what you're trying to develop, not solely focused on health and well-being of youth, but definitely including that as a component, because I think that is so much an aspect of what climate change education needs to do. Not only because people are they're feeling anxious, and because they're either depressed or they turn away from it, right? Because it's too painful. And so then we don't get we don't get action as well. So yeah, definitely the social emotional component, as well as the outlet for action, which I think is true for ESE more generally, right? If you're just hitting kids or any of us with like the problems and not giving us an outlet and here's what we can do about it and feel positive and like hopeful, then it can be too overwhelming. So that action component is really essential and helps deal with the social, emotional, or health and well-being concerns around it as well. So I'd be happy to share that with Hillary, and she could distribute it if that's of interest, that primer.
Is that the Building Climate Ready Schools in Canada document?
No, it's not. We haven't really distributed it yet, but it is ready, if, it can be distributed. So
thank you. That'd be great. I think lots of people would be interested in that.
Yeah, great. The other thing that comes to mind is we just, working with a now doctoral student here, just did a case study on Indigenous land-based climate change education, building on some of her work with the Masters of Education here. And it's published on the GEEP, I actually have it at the end, the Global Environmental Ed Partnership, which is hosted by NAAEE, the North American Association for Environmental Ed, and they've got different case studies, and it's just been published up there, and it talks about that issue of health and well-being of Indigenous students in relation to climate change and climate change education as well. So it's a good new Canadian resource. Okay, so I'm gonna I have now just a few other slides on drivers and barriers, and I think I'll just go through those quite quickly. But you can see kind of some of the drivers that we found as affecting engagement and sustainability. In terms of policy, we found that people, this is kind of a crazy graphic, people, so policy actors, as well as other policies, were the most important drivers of policy. So say if there was ministry policy, it might drive school division policy, or say municipal policy in Vancouver drove school board policy there, to have the development of climate action plans for schools and so on. So in terms of the role of people, we've looked a bit at school-based sustainability leadership and what's really the role of that, which I think we know in general from educational change and more broadly. But we also looked at things like we had a master's student who did her research, Rachel Regier, specifically on the role of community partnerships and networks and the importance of those as well. So even when there was school-based leadership or particular person, it was also in relationship with different entities. And then also, sorry, that's a little bit blurry, but distributed leadership and the importance of what we saw as a barrier, again, is sort of common sense as well. When the motivation for this work is so based in a particular teacher or particular school leader, or within a school division, you have, a leader that's really passionate about this, then if they move on, things can fizzle out. So the importance of making it more distributed across different folks, and that we found that, in a lot of cases where things were moving along really successfully, that it might have initially been led by a policy entrepreneur or an individual leader, but then it was distributed and shared, and more people got on board, and it really became a culture of action across the entire school, and in some places like Manitoba, more broadly.
We had a question from Erin Sperling, who's one of our doctoral students earlier, just saying she was curious about the gendered nature of environmental leadership. Did you collect any data on that?
We did collect some. I mean, we have all the data on kind of how people identify in terms of gender, and I can't remember how we, racialization as well, or, whether they identify are Indigenous, those sorts of things. We've done a little bit of analysis of it, but not a ton. There's lots there that could be tapped if
we were just even looking at the makeup of the room today of who's in this webinar on leadership, environmental and sustainability ed, and realizing that there are so many people who identify as female in this group.
Yeah.
We're wondering if, especially in schools, if there must be some relationship there, just because there's so many women who work in especially elementary schools. So that might be an interesting deeper dive at some point.
Yeah, it would be interesting. No, it would be really interesting, and because a lot of the ones that I'm thinking of that stand out in the data as leaders are men too. So that like there's some really interesting stories about like a male principal who had tons of bikes. Like his way of engaging with students was through bikes. And so there were bikes in the hallways, bikes in his office. So, students would come in to work on getting their bike fixed. And so it was very kind of relational orientation to leadership that happened to converge around, active transportation and sustainability, for example. So yeah, no, it would be really interesting. Well, if anyone wants to look at that, we've got lots of data there. And then we've also looked at the role of emotions as well, which is, something that I'm really interested in terms of how those, so these passionate leaders, for example, or when they are able to kind of get more people fired up, or when people turn away because they're too anxious and they're like, this is too depressing, so I'm just going to keep doing what we've been doing. Those play a huge role as, as drivers or barriers for policy and practice in ESE. Land and place as well. We looked at that and its relationship to what gets mobilized or not in policy and practice. And then a range of barriers here.
We'd actually had a question from Sybil earlier about barriers. So if you leave that on that slide just for a sec, because there's lots of
Sure.
there.
Yeah.
Can you pull out a couple of the salient points that struck you in terms of the barriers to sustainability in education policy and practice?
I mean, I think it is that building to a broader, like a lot of times it was a leader or a handful of teachers or whatever, and really stepping it up to be a broader priority that's not just like competing. We had lots of people talk about, well, there's all these things we're supposed to do and I have to decide which to actually bring to my teachers because we can't do it all, that sort of thing. But Manitoba really is a success story in terms of some of the more systemic things that they put in place that made it become more pervasive, although they've, I think, lost a bit of ground now that they're with the change of government and all that, the people that were there are no longer there as well, and the same priorities aren't there. But things like they developed the EcoGlobe programs so that because it wasn't previously a certification program in that province, just like it isn't in Saskatchewan. And so that was something. And then also resource, so providing money to schools that wanted to do work on this. So those sort of recognizing some of these other barriers around resource issues, for example, and then addressing that head on through ministry policy, which also could be school division policy that takes those steps.
Soraya's asked what I say is the toughest question, Soraya. She says, how do you motivate people to make a change in their behavior to become environmentally sustainable?
Well, some of that would be in that primer that I talked about around climate change specifically, but I think applies to ESE more broadly. Education hasn't done a super great job of looking at that so far, but other fields have, like sociology and psychology, to really understand, why, like actually the research on climate change is that education isn't as strong a factor in belief and action in climate change as political affiliation and a political ideology. So how do you deal with that? And so, what we're seeing coming out of different bodies of literature is that it really is important to frame the issues in the priorities and the language of different groups. So, it's not just like screaming at them, environment is important, but it's like, well, what is important to them? And how do we frame this in a way that connects with that, right? So like Candace Callison, who I think, she's based at UBC, had a great book looking at different communities, like business communities, Indigenous, Inuit community, and a religious Christian community, and looking at where climate change had come to matter to those communities and how it had come to matter and how they were engaging with it differently in different frames. So I think that's key, is that framing piece, and then making it, sorry, my dog's trying to get in, making it so that it addresses those social emotional aspects so that it feels like something that people can take action on, not just individually, which I think kind of like feels like not enough to people anymore, but they can see the potential for a more systemic change.
You're asking great questions, folks. We'll try our best to get to them. I'm trying to get a little bit of a flow for the questions, keep it connected to what Marcia is discussing. So I'll try my best to get them all answered here. As a part of the conversation around the framing, Diana asked, how can the barriers that you've identified, how can these barriers be openly discussed or reframed with the people that we work with?
I guess that's one way that we see this type of data by that SEPN's put out. And I think if you look at some of our infographics, that we've done things that were a bit controversial, like have leaders or laggards, or I think we're now calling it leaders and learners in the final report. But sometimes things like that are, for better or worse, the competitive aspect of like, well, you don't want to get left behind in our school or our school division, and everyone else is doing this. We don't want to be a laggard. Get with the times. It's one aspect. Also, students are huge, right? So that's a time to talk a little bit about what happened here in terms of with the school division. My daughter's class wanted to go to the climate strikes in the fall. And the teacher said, okay, well, put it together in a presentation on, how this connects with the curriculum, and we'll consider whether we go to the class. So they did this. The teachers thought that, agreed. And then, so they were planning to go, and then the school division stepped in and said, you can't go. It's too controversial. It's dangerous. No one's going to the climate strikes.
Well, and actually that addresses Sybil's question from earlier, which is how do you address the rigidity that's inevitably part of that hierarchical structure that's making decisions in school boards.
Right.
It's a really tricky problem to solve.
What ended up happening was then, so I wrote to the school division, the school leadership, saying like, this, isn't really controversial. The science is clear, and students are feeling overwhelmed, and as we've seen with the school strikes, why should we bother learning math if there's not going to be a habitable planet, when we grow up, and so on, and they want to see action on this. So anyways, a long story short, we met, they wanted to do stuff, and it ended up having this MOU. So I think in that case, it was like the school division heard, it was the students really, and coming from them and seeing the number that took the day off to go to the climate strikes anyways, right? And that they were expecting to see, and when I first met with the superintendent from the school division, he said, well, I'm thinking of starting a grade 4 gardening program, and best of intentions, but I was like, I think what my daughter and her friends want to see is not they know about climate change. What they want to see is leadership from their school and their division on this, right? So they want to see solar panels on their roofs. They want to see people prioritizing this and taking action. It's not that they need more education on it. They know. So I think that's another, mobilizing that power of not to put the responsibility on youth, but they're already doing that, and bringing that to the attention of leadership can help, realize they need to get with the times and move things on.
Yeah, and part of those times we're dealing with right now is the pandemic. We're actually struggling with the question that was asked earlier from Shelley about, given the online learning environment, and that we're all trying to adjust to, what kind of additional challenges in regards to environmental and sustainability ed do you foresee as we deal with this reality of having the pandemic layered on top of the climate crisis now?
Yeah, well, I think we have we need to do a good job of making the links there with the pandemic, and the expectations of increasing numbers and severities of pandemics due to the loss of environmental habitat for animals through climate and other factors, and that they're really linked, right? So it's not a separate issue that is like, oh, now, how are we going to get attention back on this issue? It's actually like, well, we kind of have the solution to the pandemic issue as well, moving forward, not this current, bout, but trying to avoid, increasing pandemics in the future. And so trying to make those links for people so that it's not just maybe you won't have a habitable planet from climate change, but also maybe you can have illness in the next 5 to 10 years as well. So it's another motivator, hopefully, for ESE, but we have to make that case, I think.
Yeah. And a couple of other people have asked a couple of our doctoral students around the connections to environmental racism and eco-justice education. Did you do any data collection on those topics specifically?
Yes, definitely. We asked people how they understood sustainability or engaged with it. We gave, we asked them open-endedly, and then we gave them options, which one of them was there was an Indigenous one, there was a justice framed one. So that type of kind of analysis of how people are engaging in the issues. And I think that was one of the things on the last page of the barriers was like a lot that, we, in a lot of places, we did find a lack of engagement with justice issues still, and considering environmental issues, to be in isolation from justice issues. So we have done work on that. We just had a PhD student, well, that's in the higher ed sector, but that defended this week, and she was looking at the role of historically marginalized actors in mobilizing sustainability in higher ed.
Wanja asks, how's the attempt going to build a global databases in terms of low-income contexts? And she says specifically in Africa. I think, Wanja, you're probably asking in relationship to global databases around climate change education. Is that a fair? I'm sorry, I think I'm extrapolating a little bit here, but
yes, it's true. Yeah, that is correct, Hilary. Thank you.
Well, we're just starting that project, so that'll be coming down the road for sure. I'm just working with a colleague, Erin Benevot, on a study for UNESCO looking at 50 different countries around the world, which should include some African countries, to look at their inclusion of environmental issues, including climate and biodiversity issues in curriculum and policy. So that's, getting at that a little bit, but we'll be working with colleagues and working closely with one of the leads is out of Rhodes University in South Africa. That's case study component. So I know we have some great African-based case studies in the works that'll give some detail in that area.
And one other question from Julie, who's asking if your research in the past has looked at all about the role of civics and activist education as part of that broad definition of ESE.
Well, it looked in relation to global citizenship versus the terminology of civics specifically, but because with the Sustainable Development Goals, which people may be familiar with, which were launched in 2015, they're by the UN, and there's monitoring that's done around the world in relation to those, and the component of that is related to education for sustainable development is in the same target and indicator as global citizenship. So they're kind of hand in hand, and they're in the same division within UNESCO, and there's lots of overlap between the two. So we've looked at that a little bit, and one of the UNESCO studies we did recently was on those two components, and looking at which that study was of 10 countries around the world, and looking at the extent to which they are engaging in ESD and or global citizenship and different relationships between the two. That's at the level of policy. At the level of practice, I think certainly the aspects of engagement or in ESE, there's work on action competence or different things like that are certainly, about civic and citizenship engagement in relation to environment and how important that is for learning and sense of, empowerment versus depression on these issues.
Yeah, fair enough. And I'm going to put in my own question here, if that's all right.
Sure.
We run a team of action of teacher researchers who are engaged in action research in their own classrooms on environmental learning. And I'm just wondering if any of the data you collected related to action research done by teachers in this area specifically, and or do you see a place or a role for that?
Yeah, I'll just flow to my last slide because it's kind of linked to that one bullet on that point. No, not really. Not that I'm aware of. I mean, I'm sure there must have been some overlap with, you know, some teachers or schools that had been involved in action research, but it's not something that I'm aware of instances of that from the data. But yeah, certainly I think there's lots of potential for that. I mean, one of the things, I mean, I see this as you know, SEPN's work is kind of like a large action research project in that we're working with different entities like ministries and organizations to move forward the work so that we're, you know, all learning from it and making it as useful as possible. But also smaller scale action research projects are great at the level of a classroom or a school, that sort of thing. I think, you know, one of the things to keep in mind is just how the importance of linking into the broader literature and research that's already been done on that area, because we do see in ESE a lot of one-off studies that are, you know, telling us the same things that we already knew. So how you can inform an action research project by the research that's been done before, you know, so that it's done as effectively as possible. So, and kind of related to that, there's that, this is Indigenous land and Indigenous land-based approach to climate change ed. That's the case study I was talking about earlier, which is like, I mean, in a sense, an example of an action research project where, as a, you know, a graduate student took learning from her grad degree and applied it to a program that she's working at in Winnipeg.
Terrific. And we thank you for the plug to the Environmental and Sustainability Ed and Teacher book. I was involved in that. So I'm very happy to see a plug for that one as well. This is a huge initiative that you have been leading through SEPN in terms of conducting research. I'm going to guess it's probably one of the largest in the world on these topics. And it's so impressive. Like, congratulations for doing that. But if you can't answer all people's questions, I think people should recognize that the data set you're working with, the data sets, plural, are enormous. And I think they're more than one person could possibly fit into their head all at once. So to the notion that we need ongoing research in this area. And I'm very happy that you're now going to be doing a deeper dive into climate change education. That's a great complement to what Learning for Sustainable Futures has begun here in Canada. And I think that taking that internationally is going to help all of us better understand what helps to encourage our work, what are the barriers to our work. But we're not going to get easy answers to any of this. Like, this is an ongoing pursuit. And so engaging yourselves in action research in your own classrooms, reading the research that groups like Marcia's group has been working on will just help to strengthen all of our understanding of this field and how to move it forward. So Marcia, thank you so much on behalf of everybody in this webinar today. This has been a really interesting look at the work you've been doing. We will share the resources that have been mentioned. Marcia, if you can share the primer that you mentioned, I think there'd be a high level of interest in that one as well. Would be fantastic. So,
yeah, thank you so much. And also I should, on the comment that I don't have it all in my head, you're right, because it was a very big team and including lots of grad students that have worked on different components. So yeah, just to recognize all the work of the other team members to the
absolutely
research.
And look, at the best way for people to access the results is to visit the SEPN website. So that'll be one of the first resources that we recommend as a follow-up. We really appreciate your time today. Thank you so much. I think there's tons of thank yous happening in the chat right now, following along from everybody in the room. And Adrian's got our jazz hands applause going at the same time. So thank you so much. And I know that there's going to be lots of interest in following your work moving forward.
Great. Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Thank you.